Now, hi everybody, and we're delighted to have you here for the first event in the Kildare PPN Climate Action Weekend. And as you know, there's a whole range of events on over the weekend, and Grace is going to pop up a slide at the very end just with the website details in case you want to join any of the others. And today's talk, we're delighted to have Paul Regan here from the Eastern and Midlands CARO, and he's going to go through the science aspect, what is climate change, how has it happened, and what we can do ourselves to make little changes. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Paul. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks very much, Lena, and hello, everybody. Thank you for having me at the Kildare PPN Climate Action Weekend. So just give me a second to share my screen, and then we'll get going. So, Lena, would you mind just confirming you can see that there?
Yeah, we can see it, Paul.
Yeah, perfect. I seem to be on the wrong slide, so give me a second to move back up to the top. While this is moving up, if I can ask you if you have any questions during the presentation, please, you can put them into the chat function, and do not worry if you think the question might be answered later. If it is, we'll just skip it at the end when we're going through the Q&A. And what I'm going to try and do now is I'm going to try and go through, as Kena was saying, the different types of climate action, or different information on climate action and climate change. It's kind of like a whirlwind tour of a lot of different things at once. It's going to come at a bit of a fast pace, but again, if you have any questions or queries, please ask them as you go along. So I work for the Climate Action Regional Office in the Eastern and Midlands region. And a little bit about the CARO first. We were set up in 2018 to initially have local authorities to develop adaptation strategies and to build their capacity in that area. And there's 4 CAROs in the country. So if we start looking at the map, the blue area of the CARO is the Atlantic Seaboard North, and they're based out of Mayo County Council. The red area of the map is Atlantic Seaboard South, and they're based out of Cork County Council. The orange area is the Dublin Metropolitan CARO, and they look after the 4 Dublin local authorities. And then the green area is the Eastern Midlands Climate Action Regional Office, which is mostly based in Clare County Council, but we are also supported by Kilkenny County Council on that. And if you look on the left, of the text on the left, that is the kind of areas that we currently are working on. So our role has expanded from those adaptation strategies, and now we look to build on the experience and expertise that are in the local authority sector already, to coordinate and facilitate climate action at a local and a regional level, to build the capacity within the local authority sector. And towards that, the CAROs have developed a suite of programs in climate action for local authority staff and elected members, catering to all 28,000 plus staff and elected members around the country. We also coordinate engagement between the various agencies and government departments at a national and regional level, and we translate that down into sectoral efforts and working with local authorities in that area. And finally, we also look to develop links with the third level sector to use the most available research to inform our decision making on all areas climate action. So let me ask you first, so what's the first thing you think about when you hear the words climate change? So it might be something like this. And these would be images of recent wildfires you would have seen on the news that happened in California or in Australia. And that's one image that people think about when they see climate change. Another one might be something like this, where you might see a big flood impacting urban or rural communities or farms on the news reports as well. So you see significant flooding there causing a lot of damage and impact to food production in vulnerable areas. And also you might know of people who are climate deniers, who try to argue that the climate change is not happening due to human activity. And a lot of the arguments that the people would have are on the screen right now. So the rest of the presentation is going to be kind of focused on addressing what climate deniers would say, because when people say something isn't happening, when you're hearing from other people that it is, a lot of confusion can happen, and then with confusion comes inaction. So the aim is to address all of these kind of arguments from the skeptic side, to give you a good understanding about climate change and why particular actions happen towards limiting the impact of global warming. So the overall outline of the presentation will look at climate change. It will look at the Earth's energy budget, the carbon cycle, the impact that climate change is having, and then what governments are doing, what the local authorities do, and particularly in Kildare as well. Based on all of this, what the future might look like for all of us going forward, and also what individuals can do themselves to play a part in that transition to a carbon neutral economy or society. So let's start off with talking about climate change. So I'm going to start off with a definition from the Environmental Protection Agency of what climate change is. So climate change is a significant change in the measures of climate, such as temperature, rainfall, or wind, lasting for an extended period, decades or longer. The Earth's climate has changed many times during the planet's history, with events ranging from ice ages to long periods of warmth. Now, I think the most important part of that to really focus on is the third and fourth line, where it says lasting for an extended period of decades and longer. So where weather is the day-to-day events you see outside when you're outside, or you hear on the weather report after the news, when we talk about climate, we're really talking about the changes of the typical weather you would see over an extended period of decades or longer. So the typical weather you would have within a 10 to 30 year period. Okay. And also with climate change, there's also been other names that have been used for climate change. So you can see in the yellow some of the names that have been used previously, like global warming, environmental destruction, climate mitigation. Recently, we're using climate breakdown and so forth. And the reason behind the different names is that people try to best describe what's happening. So if I give an example of a previous US president through his tweets on Twitter about how people can be confused by what global warming is, you can see so confusing, say, weather events with which is climate change, and how the words global warming can confuse that process. So you can see from the tweets here, President Donald Trump was talking about individual events that are happening day to day and arguing that because this is happening, that global warming isn't happening. So there has been an attempt by the media over the last few years in particular of trying to find the best way to describe what climate change is. And we're using other terms like the climate crisis or global heating, or in the Irish government's perspective, they've been using climate breakdown as well. But just know that it's mostly, we're talking about the same thing, just trying to find the best way to describe it. So one of the skeptic arguments is that there is no consensus on human-caused global warming, and that could be further from the truth. And in fact, loads and loads of research is showing that 95 or 97% of scientists agree that humans are caused the level of global warming that we are seeing currently. And the more expertise you have in climate science, the more that you believe that is the case and agree that that is the case. But when you're talking, or when you hear from the media, you may not be getting that perspective. And another research is showing that a lot of news programs or journalistic programs or panel shows on TV, when they're talking about climate change, they'll have one person who's a climate scientist or a climate advocate, and the other side they'll have a climate denier. And the conversation never really gets away from whether climate action or climate change caused by human activity is real or not, and never gets to what it should be talking about, which is what are we going to do to solve it? What actions are we going to take, and what's the best route possible? And I think that comes down to a bit of lazy journalism, where you just get two opposite sides to come in together to talk. Where really, in fact, it should be the opposite way. It should be everyone trying to agree on what action we need to take. And I think that is changing in the last few years, especially on panel shows that I've seen, and hopefully it will continue to change going forward. Now, let's hit some climate science to give you a kind of understanding of what's behind the cause of climate change. So we're going to start with the solar radiation budget, or the solar energy budget, as sometimes it's called. So if we start off with the amount of solar radiation that comes from the Earth, and we're going to call, or from the sun, we're going to call that 100. So we'll take that as 100%. That travels out from the sun across space, across to all the planets, and including to Earth. When it hits our atmosphere, about 23% of it is reflected by the clouds or aerosols or atmospheric gases that are in the atmosphere, and it shoots back out into space. You also have about 20% of that radiation gets absorbed into the atmosphere and heats the atmosphere. Then we have 58% that reaches the surface. 8% of that sun or solar radiation will be reflected by this part of the surface, such as the ice caps or the tops of snow-capped mountains. So mainly where you see white surfaces. Then you've got about 45% that's absorbed by the surface in both the land and the ocean, and that will heat the Earth up. And as the Earth heats up, it will emit outward radiation or infrared radiation. That infrared radiation will go back up into the atmosphere, And when it gets into where the greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere, some of that will escape out into space, but we will have some that gets trapped by the greenhouse gases and gets turned back towards Earth and comes back down to the surface. Again, the outward radiation going up into the atmosphere and then returning back down, being trapped by greenhouse gases, adds additional heat to the Earth. And that causes a feedback loop where the Earth starts to heat up more and more and more. And that's where we're starting to see these kind of extreme weather events happening. Now, saying that, with the greenhouse gases, we do need to have a certain level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So if we had no greenhouse gases whatsoever, and all the heat that we take in from the solar radiation from the sun was radiated out into space, the Earth would be about 31 degrees cooler than it is now on average, which would not really be very beneficial for life on the planet. So we do need a certain level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere for us as species and wildlife to thrive. Now, these two graphs here are going to show us the makeup of the amount of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere from human activities. That's the graph on the left. And the graph on the right gives you the atmosphere composition. So what makes up our atmosphere? So we're going to focus on the graph on the left first off. So from human activity, we have 65% is carbon dioxide that comes from the burn of fossil fuels or industrial processes like the production of cement or concrete. So from fossil fuels is what we use to heat our homes, what we use to drive our cars, and so anything that uses oil, gas, and coal, etc. We also have 11% carbon dioxide coming from forestry or other land uses, so deforestation, cutting down trees, and the other land uses like mining and ploughing in. So we've got 16% comes from methane, we have 6% that comes from nitrous oxide, and we've got 2% that comes from F gases like chlorofluorocarbons or hydrochlorofluorocarbons, as they're called. Now, if we move to the right-hand side, we're going to look at the overall atmosphere composition. So what makes up our atmosphere, basically? And before I get into it, I'm going to ask you a question, just to quickly answer in your own heads. Which one of those segments is carbon dioxide? So carbon dioxide from human activities makes up 76%. How much of that is part of the overall atmosphere composition? So as you're answering that, I just need to do an adjustment on my own screen to remove something so I can see it fully. Okay, so you should have the answer in your own heads now. And I'm going to tell you that the answer is the 0.04% of the entire atmosphere is made up of CO2 or carbon dioxide. So we've got 78% as nitrogen, 20.95% is oxygen, and we have argon at 2.5%, sorry, 0.93%, and water vapor, I have it down as 2.5%, but depending on how hot it is or how cold it is, that will change. So in really hot temperatures, that could be up as far as 4%, in really cold temperatures, it could be down as far as 1%. So water vapor does change, and that is a greenhouse gas as well. So carbon dioxide makes up 0.04%. So when I say that to a lot of people, people are shocked that it seems so little and it has such an impact. But if you remember from the last slide, I was saying if there was no greenhouse gases whatsoever, and carbon dioxide is one of the biggest greenhouse gases we have, the Earth would be 31 degrees cooler than it is. So even with the 0.04%, that's having a huge impact on that outward radiation returning back into the surface and reheating the Earth. Now, to these two graphs here, if we look at the graph on the left, this is the Keeling curve. This is probably the most famous graph we have for measuring the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The records are taken, or the measurements are taken from a measurement station up in the mountains in Hawaii. So it's away from large industrial areas, which could have impact, like so emitting carbon dioxide. So it's way, obviously Hawaii is in the middle of the ocean, and it gives us kind of the best reflection we can have of the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So you can see that the zigzag curve there all the way up, starting from 1960 all the way up to 2020, that's the level of CO2 we have. And then the line going through is the average level we have over that year. So you can see it is just under 420, so just 420 parts per million, or it works out as 0.04%. And then if we look at the graph on the right, this will show us the level of CO2 or carbon dioxide that we've had in the atmosphere for the last 800,000 years. And you can see on the very right-hand side of that graph that from 1950, the carbon dioxide has never been as high as it is now. And you can see how much higher it is compared to before. I also want to point out that in that graph, you can see that the carbon dioxide has gone up high and down low to a certain degree. And I'm going to explain that now shortly as well. So what impact is the CO2 having? So you can see in this graph, which is sourced from NASA, GISS, NOAA, the NCI, and ESRL, you can see the sources at the bottom of the screen, that there is a direct correlation between the level of CO2 in the atmosphere and the temperature that we are experiencing on the planet. And you can see that this is from 2019 where the ppm, so parts per million, was 410. It is closer to 420 now, and you can see that the temperature has increased as CO2 has gone up. So in terms of evidence or any skeptics, it's unequivocal that CO2 in the atmosphere caused by human activities is causing the extreme temperatures and the rising global temperatures that we are seeing today. Now, to show you how this looks on an individual country level, this short video I'm going to show you is going to show you the average temperature per year per country. Now, before I press play, I'm going to explain it. So there's a legend at the top of the screen. So you can see the different colors in the circles at the top right. So if you see a light blue or a medium blue or a dark blue, that just shows you how much colder it has been from the baseline time period. And if it's yellow, orange, or even a darker orange, that means it's been hotter since the baseline period. The baseline period is 1951 to 1980. So they're taking the average temperature from that time. And then they compared every other year between that. Now, as this loads up, you'll see that every continent is kind of colored in the background. If you're looking for Ireland, it's 8 from the left, it's 8 across and 3 down, if you want to keep an eye on that. You also be able to keep an eye on the oceans on the right-hand side. And we also have Antarctica on the bottom right. So at the minute, you're kind of seeing a lot of blue, which means that these years have been colder than the baseline year of 1951 to 1980. And if you remember, I said before about climate, it's the average weather you see over decades or longer. So what you're really looking for here is trends. So if you see a particular color showing up for a long period, you could say that's the climate, as opposed to 1 year of a weather event. So we're getting closer to the baseline year now, and you're kind of seeing the oranges and reds and blues now and again. And now we're hitting the baseline year, so you're going to see a lot around the same temperature. And then from now on, we start to see a change. You're going to start seeing a lot more red, a lot more orange. And you're seeing this occurring over a number of years, over decades and longer, which shows you that there's a change in the temperature on a climate level of decades. And what that graph shows is there's nowhere in the world that's not experiencing hotter temperatures, including our oceans and Antarctica and so on. So everyone has been impacted by this. Just give me a second here. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the carbon cycle. So this is the next important part. So in terms of the carbon cycle, this is how carbon moves through the atmosphere and the Earth and the planet. There's 2 levels of the carbon cycle. There's the slow carbon cycle, which happens over hundreds of millions of years, and there's the fast carbon cycle, which can happen on a seasonal basis, a yearly basis. So if I start off with the long-term carbon cycle, so you have carbon that's stored in the atmosphere. And that carbon will mix with water through precipitation events. And through that process, will develop a carbonic acid, which hits rocks. And rocks over time, as well as through erosion, will break down. That sediment from the rocks will then transfer onto the land, which eventually will hit water bodies, will flow into the ocean, will join other sediments in the ocean, and then rest on the ocean floor. And over time, that will it will mix with bicarbonate ions and so on and develop rocks over time. And then through tectonic movements, so the movement of the plates, the land structures will change on the planet over time. You'll have a releasing of more carbon as that happens. You'll also have that happen through volcanic activity. More carbon will enter into the atmosphere. You also have another element of the slow carbon cycle, which is the decomposition of vegetation and plants and of species such as dinosaurs from millions and millions of years ago, which are stored under the ground, and they are formed in the form of oil or gas, coal, and etc. And again, the movement of carbon from the atmosphere to the land and back up again happens over hundreds of millions of years. We look at the fast carbon cycle. So we take carbon from the atmosphere. We've got vegetation and plants who take carbon in as part of the photosynthesis process. So in other words, of how they grow. and they respire oxygen out. As they grow, animals and so will eat the vegetation or crops, humans, and as we respire, we release CO2 back in the atmosphere. When vegetation and species decompose over time, they will also release carbon back in the atmosphere. And again, that happens over seasons, years, maybe tens, hundreds of years. And now, if human activity wasn't involved at all, that would mainly stay balanced in the long term. So if you remember the graph I showed you before of the 800,000 years where you saw the CO2 going up and down. So when the Earth's climate is relatively stable in terms of millions of years, the Earth will go through ice age stages, and then really warm stages, but it in itself will balance out over time. Especially in the last 200 years, the climate has been relatively stable, and that has allowed for plants and species to really flourish. What human activity does, it has been extracting carbon from the slow carbon cycle and putting it back into the atmosphere. And we don't have enough trees or vegetation or means of taking the carbon out of the atmosphere in the fast cycle. And therefore, the carbon in the CO2 in the atmosphere is too high, and it's trapping too much radiation that comes out of the earth from the heating of the solar radiation. And that's caused the feedback loop, and that's how we're getting the temperature. So human activity in terms of extracting fossil fuels, so taking up oil or gas, mining coal, using that, burning into the atmosphere, that's the real issue, and that's the real problem behind the issues that we're seeing. So what impact is climate change having? So because of the extra greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we are seeing hotter temperatures. So this is mostly experienced and will be mostly experienced in the future at the extreme. So on our coldest days, they'll become much warmer. On our very hottest days, they will become more warmer as well. So you can, if you can remember back to a few years ago, in the summer of 2018, we had really, really hot temperatures. And in fact, 5 of the hottest temperatures in the record have happened in the last 6 years. So in the summertime, that's going to have a real impact on people. So heat-related illnesses will occur. It's very hard to cool down in those temperatures. People working outside will find it very difficult, but it also impacts our infrastructure as well. So in terms of road infrastructure, so you get bleeding roads and damage and potholes and etc. But also because of the hotter temperatures, you have the growing cycle of plants and vegetation is happening earlier in the year, and the life cycle of the wildlife is not matched to that as much as it used to be, and that will continue to be different. So when new species are born, so the young of species are born, they're not going to have as much available food for them because the plants and vegetation cycle has started earlier than what they're used to, and animals cannot adapt as quick as humans can. So they are really being impacted by the change in the growing cycle. In terms of more frequent droughts, we are experiencing drought conditions, but we will experience more drought conditions, and the droughts will last for longer as well. So again, in summer 2018, we had, I don't know if it's between 8 and 14 weeks of no rain, if you remember that right. So the top left picture on the screen will show you the impact that had in the vegetation over a number of weeks, going from really green to really brown. We had in Mead in the middle picture, sorry, the picture on the right, because the ground was so dry, the archaeologists were able to discover more tombs over near Newgrange because it showed markings on the ground from where the tombs are. They were unknown before, and they are currently being investigated or excavated, I should say, at the minute. We also had in Wicklow, in the Pulifica Reservoir, the water felt so low at that time that an island that was in the middle of the reservoir appeared again that people had forgot was there, and there's a monastery even on that island. It was covered with water for so long that people had forgot it was there over the generations. And also it impacted livestock all around the country in terms of getting water and making sure they were hydrated enough, especially the young calves, and in the picture in the middle. So when you put those two things together, hotter temperatures and drought, that has real impacts around the world, in Ireland as well, but obviously more in hotter countries. But it can also lead to a lack of water. So you'll have hosepipe bans, you'll have less water available for livestock, such as the picture in the middle where a farmer went into a shopping centre, bought as much water as he could because he didn't have any water at home to feed his livestock. You also have an increase in gorse fires because of the drying out of the vegetation, and there's also a lack of water in helping to stop those fires. So like Ireland is known as a fairly wet country, but we are experiencing those issues here. So you can imagine what other places in the world are experiencing as well, it's better in hotter climates. In terms of flooding, we are seeing more extreme flooding happening in Ireland and around the world. And it's projected that while we will have less rain in the summer and spring months, we will have a lot more rain in the winter months. And to the point that even though we have less in summer and spring, overall throughout the year, we will be experiencing more precipitation in terms of the amount of falls. So that's going to be an extreme amount of water falling in a short space of time. And we are going to see more episodes of flooding events, which can impact vulnerable communities, isolate people, impact businesses operating, people getting to shops for food, and just damaging property and cultural assets as well. In terms of other extreme events, we are going to experiencing more intense windstorms. So we might experience less windstorms overall, but the windstorms that we do experience will be more intense. And we are already seeing the impact that this can have. So it can be as simple as a tree falling on the road, blocking the road. People can't get to work or to school. It could be a case that property will be damaged by, like roofs will be damaged by high winds or trees falling on buildings. And also in coastal areas, when there's storms, if there's high wind storms, you'll have storm surges of a lot of seawater coming in on the coastal areas. And again, like flooding, damaging property and vegetation. We will see more extreme events as well as the temperatures go up. More water vapor will enter into the atmosphere from the oceans. And because there's more water vapor in the atmosphere, we will see more extreme events, such as the one we had in February 2018, same year as the drought and the heat, where we had in North Kildare, from the beach to the east, we had very high snow drifts. I'm sure some of you might remember them. Some people were trapped in their homes for a week or so and couldn't get out, and we had to get local farmers and communities to help us clear those roads as well. But that has a big impact on people getting food, being able to get to shops, and also for emergency services, trying to get the people who need their help. And the image on the bottom left shows you an ambulance getting stuck in those conditions. Sea level rise is also a factor. So as the temperatures get warmer, the ice caps start to melt, but also as the temperatures get warmer, the water expands as well. So it's projected by the end of this century, so to 2100, that the sea level will rise between 0.8 of a meter and 1.2 of a meter. That'll have a big impact on coastal areas, especially low-lying coastal areas, and it may come with a decision, especially in other parts of the world, but also possibly in Ireland, where decisions will be made of whether or not it's beneficial or worthwhile trying to stop the sea level coming in. So some parts may be allowed to flood in the future. Now, the pictures on the left, so the picture of Ireland and the picture on the very far left, these show what Ireland would look like if 70 meters of sea level rise occurred. So that's the melting of all the ice caps in the world and the expansion of the ocean through heat as well. So you can see that maybe in a few hundred years, this is what Ireland might look like to generations in the future. And it's a lot different than what it looks like now. And the picture on the left just shows you what Kildare could look like and the areas that would be under sea level if those areas were allowed to flood, which is distinctly different from what it is now. And again, that has impact, wide-ranging impact on farm agriculture and accessibility and mobility of people as well. I'll give you an example from across the world. So in Tuvalu, which is an island in the Pacific Ocean in Oceania, they are a fairly low country. They have a population of about 12,000 people. The top right picture shows you an image of what the country looks like using the sea level rise application from the previous slide. And the bottom right picture shows you what the country looks like with 17 meters, so 17 meters of sea level rise. It's totally covered. It's not around anymore, basically. And the picture on the bottom middle is a picture of the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Communications, Simon Kofe, in Tuvalu. He did a presentation to the COP26 last week, or even 2 weeks ago at this point, where he did his speech in the sea. So you can see that the sea is up to above his knees. And he did that to highlight the impact that sea level rise is going to have on Tuvalu and other island nations around the world. So these countries may not have land anymore in the future with sea level rise. They may have to relocate. And actually, if you try and go and find and watch Simon's speech, you hear about plans to digitize their ancestry or their history of the country, so they can protect it if they have to relocate, so they can keep their culture and so on. It's a very impactful speech, so I do encourage you to go look for it. So what are governments doing? So the most famous thing that governments are doing, I suppose, or the most talked about, is the Paris Agreement. So countries have been coming together to try and reach agreements of global action on climate change. And it was really at COP21, or the Conference of Parties 21, where all countries came together to agree to work together to keep temperatures below 2 degrees, and a global increase of temperature below 2 degrees, and to make real efforts to keep it as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. So anything over 1.5 has drastic implications to really vulnerable countries. Anything over 2 degrees would be far worse for the rest of the world as well. If we move on to COP26, so COP26 took place in Glasgow at the end of October up to in November as well, so finished a few weeks ago. And in that, they made some real promising action, but also they have some critical things as well. So they agreed to make more efforts to try and reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. They agreed that they would take the latest research from the IPCC climate science findings and use that to inform what action the countries will take to keep temperatures to as close to 1.5 as possible. They also agreed to double the amount of money that developed countries will give to developing countries to help them to put in infrastructure to adapt to the impacts of flooding and sea level rise, etc. But they're also critical because on the very last day after all that agreement was made, India and China decided to push for a change in the terminology used. So instead of having a phase out of coal, they put forward a change to a phase down of coal. Now, because a lot of agreements were already made and this was the last day, everyone at COP had to accept this change in terminology. And the president of COP25, Alok Sharma, at the time apologized that this was the case, but they wanted to protect the agreements already made during that COP. I suppose the only promising thing to come out of it is that all countries have agreed to come back next year with more ambitious plans to ensure that they can achieve the 1.5 degrees or keep the global temperature increased below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Two of the biggest efforts to come as part of the Paris Agreement is Joe Biden's Build Back Better plan, which is, and also the European Green Deal. So they're both very similar. So when I talk about the European Green Deal, which I'm going to focus on, it also refers to elements that the Build Back Better plan in the US has as well. So Europe are trying to become the first carbon neutral continent by 2050. They're looking to decouple economic growth from fossil fuel use. So they're looking to increase the use of renewable energies around the continent. They're looking to enhance the circular economy, so reduce waste. They're looking to move to smart mobility and become more efficient basically in how the resources that they use. And also train people up to be part of the green economy, the people who are, say, maybe involved with the fossil fuels, and they will be most affected by any changes. So a just transition to ensure that no one is left behind, basically. In terms of Ireland, most of our efforts have, in terms of a coordinated approach, have happened since 2015 with the introduction of the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act. I'll briefly discuss that as I talk further. But also this year we have an amendment to that, which is now the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Amendment Act 2021. So in the 2015 Act, that produced a national adaptation framework, a national mitigation plan, and that was the first efforts to coordinate action on a national and regional scale. Now, from the national adaptation framework, local authorities were tasked with developing adaptation strategies. And again, I'm going to go into Kildare's one very shortly. And then from the national mitigation plan, that was replaced by the Climate Action Plan in 2019, which again, only a few weeks ago was replaced by the Climate Action Plan 2021. And these plans provide a pathway of how we're going to achieve net zero carbon society by 2020 or 2050, and also a 51% reduction in our emissions by 2030. Now, to go into the Kildare plan, so in terms of adaptation strategy, the process that was used, Kildare County Council looked at the weather events that have occurred in the last 30 years that impacted the operations of the council and recorded the impact that it had and the level of risk and vulnerability that the local authority would have to those events in the future. And they used that along with what those events were projected to be like in the next 20, 30 years. And from that, they were able to develop 127 actions of how they could build their resilience to the impacts of climate change. And those actions fall under the 6 headings you see on the screen there. And every local authority has actions. So nationally, we've got 2,462 actions across the country, and we report on those every year and how we're doing. And currently, we've got 12.5% of all actions completed, with 84% of those actions are underway to completion or full implementation as well. So there's good progress made by the sector to date. In terms of the Climate Action Plan 2021, as I said previously, this will provide a pathway of how we achieve what's called our national climate objective. Our national climate objective is to achieve a climate resilient, biodiversity rich, environmentally sustainable and carbon neutral economy by 2050. Now, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what's in the plan. So in terms of, as you can see, kind of see this on the infographics on the page as well. So in terms of electricity, we're looking to increase our renewable energy from wind and solar by up to 80% by 2030. We're going to introduce a small scale generator scheme for farmers, businesses and communities to provide opportunities for them to generate electricity and sell it back to the grid. Under enterprise, looking to accelerate the use of carbon neutral low temperature heating, energy from heat to come from renewable sources, promote the employment and decarbonisation, so promoting employment in the green economy going forward, and align supports that bring around emissions reductions. In terms of homes and buildings, they're going to introduce a new natural retrofit plan, which will help make energy upgrades and make your buildings more energy efficient and more affordable as well. In terms of transport, they're looking to enhance the public transport services, and they're going to expand cycling and walking infrastructure, expand the electrification of the bus and rail fleet, and increasing the use of biofuels in transport, particularly for haulage. Under agriculture, they're looking to increase the energy production of agroforestry and woodland creation, increasing production of biomethane and reducing the use of nitrogen in farming activities. Under land use, forestry and marine, they're looking to increase deforestation under a new forestry program, which will start in 2023, and that will increase the amount of trees that we have in the country, and we're going to plant more and more every year. Under the circular economy, we're looking to reduce the level of food waste by 50% by 2030. Ensuring all plastic packaging is reusable or recyclable by 2030. Under a just transition, they're going to expand the funding that's made available to the communities that are most affected by transitioning to a low or net zero carbon economy, particularly in the Midlands where Bord and Mona has been operating. They're also going to enhance citizen engagement through empowering everyone to help deliver the climate objective, improve climate literacy through education and communications to help people understand climate change, something like what we're doing here, but probably to a higher level, and increase the number of sustainable energy communities to 1,500 in the country. So at the minute, there is around 600 in the country, and local authorities are helping for community groups to help get them going in SECs. And I believe there's someone, Gamer Conway, who's the SEC mentor for Kildare, will be doing an event later in the weekend as well about the SECs. So if you can, please attend that as well. So based on all these efforts, what will our future look like? So I find it's really good to show what is the outcome basically of all these efforts and plans and strategies. So in terms of adaptation, you're going to see a lot more sustainable drainage and green infrastructure used. So you're going to see, in terms of drainage, you're going to see a lot more planting and vegetation around drainage areas, so that when there is a lot of water around, these will soak up the extra water and help stop flooding events happening. You're going to see a lot more vegetation and green infrastructure around waterways. This will help to keep chemicals and so out of waterways and hopefully maintain or improve the water quality of those bodies. You're also going to see areas, especially in urban areas, which could be, when there's no water or very little water, they can be used as walkways or parks, but they're designed to take excess water when there is flooding events and keep them away from valuable property and infrastructure. And then that water will then recede at a slower rate after the flooding event occurs. That will help protect people's livelihoods and jobs and their property as well. You're going to see the designation of a more natural floodplain. So as we experience more precipitation events, it's most likely that you'll have land further upriver that will be allowed to flood to stop the excess water going downriver to urban areas. And you could potentially see farmers or landowners who allow their land to flood being compensated for this as well, because obviously it impacts them not being able to use that land at those times. You're going to see more innovative ways of harvesting water. So when it rains, storing that water for purposes later on. And you're also going to see a lot more innovative and smart uses of technology to use or to make irrigation efforts of food and crops more efficient as well. If we look at the top right-hand picture, this is an example of a green roof. So if the roof is covered in vegetation, they obviously will use the water they need to grow, but then an excess water is moved down into underground storage, which is filtered and cleaned and then used by the building for grey water purposes when need be, especially in times in drought. As I said about the climate action plan, you're going to see a lot more tree planting programs happening, not just in Ireland, but around the world. And you'll also see them designed in a way where there's fire breaks. So when we have more drought conditions and higher temperatures, which cause more wildfires, that can cause a lot of damage to woodlands and the many trees that we need to take carbon out of the atmosphere. So we'll be designed in a way where there will be fire breaks. So if one part of the landscape of trees goes on fire, that the rest will be protected or limit the impact of them spreading. In terms of helping to improve or maintain biodiversity, you'll see a lot more natural borders on farmlands and around watercourses. So what this will do is it will help protect the wildlife that live near the hedgerows. It'll also help protect the level of food available for them and protect their habitats. In water bodies, this is also the case, but it would also help or limit the amount of chemicals or fertilizer that goes into water bodies, helping to maintain or improve the water quality of those water bodies as well, which will help increase the wildlife and biodiversity levels too. You'll also see a lot of biodiversity corridors happening. So where you have areas of high biodiversity, you will see efforts to make or to bring those together. So have a connection between the two. So those wildlife can move back and forth depending on what the climate is like or what happens in those areas, which will help promote and sustain biodiversity levels for in the longer term. You also see a lot more action towards protecting wildlife as they travel across dangerous areas such as motorways, like in the bottom left picture. And a good example of a major project that's happened is the Great Green Wall in Africa, where they're trying to build a big wall of trees and vegetation right across the continent to stop the spreading of the Sahara Desert, basically. But it also has other benefits from as well, which will be as a biodiversity corner to promote and help biodiversity levels in the area too. We are going to see more people living in cities in the future as well. So especially in Ireland, the population is set to increase by another 1 million in the next decades or so. And people will be encouraged to live in urban areas because that's where the services are, and that's where the service can be brought to people more efficiently as well. You're also going to see, I suppose, a change in how cities are planned for the future. This is especially happening in Europe, where you're seeing a 15-minute city kind of plan taking place, so that wherever you are living in the city, that whatever you need is within 15 minutes of where you're living. So if that's access to public transport or to local shops or whatever, to avoid the need of you to need a car to get to where you need to go, basically. You're going to see an increased level of broadband. So we have a national broadband plan in Ireland, which still needs a lot of work to be completed. But we're also seeing a lot more remote working. So especially since COVID happened, we're seeing an increase in the number of remote working hubs. So 2 examples are DigiClare and Laois Collective Hub. But we're also, in the news last week, there is the development of one in Kildare and Naas as well. So this will allow people to go and rent a space in the remote working hub, to work from there, have access to broadband, to be able to talk to people remotely, and to avoid having them to commute long distances for work or for meetings and be part of the long commutes in the morning, say, for example, to Dublin. You're going to see an increased use of renewable energy. So we're going to see a lot more wind farms, particularly off the coast. Ireland and Scotland are hailed as the 2 best places in Europe to take advantage of the potential of wind as a renewable source. So there is an effort to have a lot more wind farms around Ireland and Scotland. So you're going to see wind farms around the country, probably mostly likely in the west because of where that is situated in terms of the Atlantic, but you also see some of the East Coast as well. You're going to see a lot more solar farms on land. So with the ability of businesses and communities to be able to sell back to the grid, you'll see a lot more planning application and permissions granted for solar farms around the country to generate that electricity. And in the future, you may also see that solar panels become part of the fabric of buildings, especially in urban areas, or they'll be, like in the picture on the bottom right, they'll be vertical and part of the wall, and it'll be a commonplace to see that going forward. In terms of retrofitting houses, so there's a national retrofitting program which is aiming to bring all old housing stock up to at least a B2 standard. So if we look at the bottom picture on the right of the house, if that was retrofitted, it may need the floor to be insulated like the picture above it. If you go to the bottom left picture, it may need some insulation in the roofs and possibly in the walls. The picture above that with the windows, you may need to have double or triple glazing put in and the windows resealed. And the middle picture, you may need to change from an oil or gas heating to air to water heat pump. And all the efforts will bring a house to a higher energy efficiency, meaning lower energy costs as well. And the picture in the top left shows you what that house, same house as the one before, looks like after a retrofit. So there's no chimney anymore. It's very energy efficient. It has a porch as well to help keep the heat in when you open the front door. There's 2 doors at the front. In terms of alternative fuel vehicles, so there's a big increase of electric vehicles projected for Ireland in particular. You're going to see that electric vehicles will get priority in parking in urban areas as well. You'll see a lot more charging stations offered by shopping centres that have large car parks, and possibly by local authorities as well if in areas that are needed. And also there'll be commercial areas as well. But outside of electric vehicles, there's also other types of fuel needed. So you're going to see other efforts such as hydrogen fuel or biomass fuel used, and particularly for haulage as well, because electric vehicles would not be the best thing for long haulage of say big Arctic trucks bring containers and so around Europe. Okay, so how electric vehicles will be charged in the future may also change. So there's been a few examples. I can think of one in Japan where they were trialing that electric vehicles will be able to charge while they're driving on the road. So they go into a lane where there's like a charging lane, and as you're driving along, you're able to charge up your battery as you go. You'll also see petrol stations, particularly the bigger petrol stations, change to one where you can charge your car within about 20 minutes of full charge, and that might get even faster in the future. And they may also offer a place where you could sit down, hang out, maybe get some food while that's happening. And you'll see that going to happen around the country as well. Public transport is going to become more electrified, so it may be commonplace that you'll see that when a bus is stopped to pick up people, that a charging arm might come down from the wall and it might charge from the top of the roof, and the bus will charge as it's waiting for customers to come on. You'll see public transport get prioritized more in urban areas around the world. If you look at the picture on the top right, you'll see lanes will be just sanctioned just for bus lanes only, and you'll have better bus stops as well. So instead of getting caught in the rain waiting for a bus, you'll actually have places you can stay under cover and out with the wind and keep warm, and the buses will not be held up by other traffic that's on the road. A concept that's been trialed in China is a tram where you are where the tram will travel over the traffic as it's going along. And that could be something you might see in the future as well. There's definitely the prioritization of cycling and walking in urban areas, but definitely cycling in rural areas as well. So we're going to see a lot more cycle-only lanes or cycle-only tracks in urban areas that protect them from traffic. So we're already seeing that, particularly in Dublin, where a bicycle or cycle lane might be inside of where cars park to protect them from moving traffic. But you'd also see other lanes like the top left picture where it's just devoted simply for cycling, and they won't have to meet traffic at all. They won't have to stop at traffic lights or whatever. And you might also see connectivity services happening or occurring where you might on your phone pick out an app and order a bicycle to turn up where you need to be, and the bicycle will be automated. It'll arrive with no one on it. It'll stop, so it'll make a tricycle. When it stops, it'll turn into a two-wheel bicycle. You use the bicycle to where you need to go, and once you get off it, return back to a charging station or to somebody else. So there's efforts of that happening around. I think in Boston at the minute actually is where I saw a recent video of that happening. So you can expect services like that, connectivity services, to be popping up in the future as well. In terms of public realm, you're going to see a lot more improvements in urban areas of public realm, mainly for two reasons. One is in urban areas, in hotter temperatures, they are hotter than rural areas because the materials used in buildings take in the radiation, and then as they heat up, they release more radiation as well. So it's called urban heating. Or the heat island effect. So by having shading from trees and vegetation, that helps to reduce the impact that has. So you're going to see a lot more trees and vegetation used around buildings to help offset that. But also you're going to have areas which people want to go visit. So encourage people to want to walk through those areas on their way to work or on their way to the shops to stop them going, or to get into a car to go to a shop, basically. So it's going to encourage more active mobility. Cities of the future will look different as well. As I said, you'll have more connection to nature, more vegetation to help cool the buildings. Buildings might also be all painted white to reflect that heat as well. There's also thinking of what a building can achieve as well. So there's a different mindset going to be occurring, especially that's seen in Europe, in particular in Copenhagen at the minute. So the two bottom pictures are two examples of this happening. So the bottom left picture is of a waste to power plant, which is also a ski resort. It's like a ski slope and a snowboarding slope people can use every day of the week in Copenhagen. That power plant doesn't emit any harmful gases at all. It stores those gases and uses them as energy. And then on the bottom right is this new sustainable housing and how that's built in a sustainable, energy efficient way. If you're interested in that kind of thing, the architect for those two buildings is a guy called Bjarke Ingels. And if you have Netflix, there's a really good show called Abstract, which has one episode devoted to him. And he talks about these buildings and the mindset of what needs to change in buildings for a carbon neutral society in the future. So I encourage you to have a look at that if you have time. In terms of waste and circular economy, we're going to see a lot more recycling possible. You're going to see a lot more options of or different types of material you can put in recycling. You're going to see products that are made will be made out of material that's 100% recyclable as well, or it will use material that has been recycled in the past. There's also an enterprise down the central there called Green Generation. That's the picture in the middle, where they are taking food waste and farm waste, and they are creating biomethane, which has been injected into the gas network. And that's one of the first in the country, but it won't be the last either. So you're going to see the use of waste that's otherwise would expel greenhouse gases in the atmosphere being used to help create the energy in a clean way. You're going to see a lot less packaging or plastic packaging in shops, and shops may change on how they present and store food. One innovation from a few years ago is the top right picture is a bowl of water. So instead of having a plastic bottle of water, you have a bowl of water that's covered in seaweed. The seaweed is fully edible, so you could put that bowl of water into your mouth to have a drink. And if you don't like seaweed, you can obviously bite into the water, take the water and put the seaweed into the compost because it's fully biodegradable as well. So now we've talked about what governments have done, the infrastructure they need to put in place. And now we need to talk about what you can do. So while governments can help support people and provide the infrastructure for people to change, people also need to make changes themselves. And most of this will come down to behavior change. So Western countries, in terms of energy use per people, per person, is really high compared to the rest of the world. So the actions that we can take are really about reducing our energy use or using energy from renewable sources. So in terms of what people can do, I like to use this this kind of graphic to kind of go through it. So I start with the top left and going to work down. So in terms of what you can do, you can learn more about climate change. You can get up to speed on what's happening, get an understanding of how it works, and you can talk to your friends and work in school about what changes they can make. You also have the power of your vote. So when you are not happy with decisions that are made by elected members, whether at national or local level, if you're not happy with it, the next time the voting election comes around, you vote for someone who will make the changes that you want. And that's very important. You can be a catalyst for that. You also can make changes yourself. And then when you make a change, it's to be strong and to maintain that change. So any behavioral change is tough. It's easy to do it for a little while, but to maintain that is very difficult. So that's probably the hardest thing you can do, is to maintain a new habit, which is better to solve the global warming problem. You could organize the planting trees. So if you're in school, you can plant trees. If you're in a business, you can plant trees in your land, or a home. If you have a bit of land, you can also plant trees there. You could eat less meat. You can use less fast fashion. So you can buy clothes that last for a long time instead of only for a few months. You can make sure that the clothes that you buy come from sustainable sources as well. Going back up to the top right, in terms of travel, if you're using a car, make sure you use the most fuel efficient car you can, or electric car. If you can cycle or walk, please do that. If you can use public transport, please use that, especially when the public transport is electrified and that electricity is coming from renewable energy. If you can avoid flying, do, but obviously if you're flying to the US, you can't go by boat. It's just not realistic. Airplanes are looking for more climate friendly fuel, I should say, and when that comes in, that may help as well. In terms of your energy supplier, try to pick an energy supplier that provides the most renewable energy possible, and there's different options out there. In your home, you can choose more energy efficient light bulbs, or when you're buying new appliances, you could choose the most energy efficient appliances there as well. In terms of electricity use, when you're finished with something, turn it off at the power point. If you are washing your clothes, instead of using the dryer and it's dry outside, use the drying line. And in terms of retrofitting or being part of SCCs in your local area, you can install photovoltaic solar panels on your home, which will help to use renewable energy for the energy that you use in the house. And also, in terms of food, buy local, buy from local farms. Make sure that the carbon footprint of where you're buying from is as low as possible. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Hope it was interesting for you. And if you have any questions, I can take them now.
Thanks, Paul. That was really, really interesting. And I think the science of climate change is so complex, but having those graphics, it just really brings it home in a really clear way. I was just going to ask you. You mentioned the media, and I think there has been a bit of a sea change lately, like John Williams in RTE, for example, committing to do a bit more on climate change. Do you see that as well, generally, that the media is there is a bit of a shift?
Yeah, definitely in the last few years, I think there's been a shift for sure. Like I've been involved in the climate action space just for the last few years, but even before, when I would have been watching panel shows, it would have been, the conversation would have been a climate advocate and a climate denier, and I would never get past the science and the value or the accuracy of the science. And we are seeing that changing now.
Yeah,
which is good.
I have to say, I can see it myself, and I think it's a really positive thing. It's also really good to see the potential, I suppose, for the future, kind of side by side with the horrible facts, to see that there's such a great potential to change the way we live and do things differently. That's just really encouraging as well.
Yeah, that's my favorite part of the presentation, actually, is what would I look like in the future, basically. Because you can see a lot of plans and actions, but what does that mean? I think it's important to show what it could be like.
Exactly, absolutely. And thank you so much for that. That was really good, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. There's a few comments there to say thank you. And if nobody has any questions, I think we can let everybody go. Oh, actually, yes, Grace is just popping up the details here of the Climate Action Weekend, the website. As we said earlier, there's loads of great events on, so there's still time to register, and all the details are up on the website. Thanks, Grace.